If you had a microscope and could look at a piece of a leaf, you would see thousands of tiny openings which branch out until the leaf has all of the materials it needs. What happens now?
Welcome to this mini lecture. Today we're going to be talking about 5 useful effects that you can use in After Effects right now. So here we are in After Effects, and let's talk about the first one, which is levels. Okay, so this is not a really sexy effect. It's not going to make things explode or bend or distort or do anything crazy like that. But this is an effect that I use in every job. Always. Okay, and let me explain what it does for those of you who don't know. So I have this photo of Don Draper here, the character Don Draper, obviously from Mad Men, which is a show on AMC. And basically, I think Don Draper looks better in black and white, right? So I wanted to take this color photo of Don Draper and make it black and white. And just say this was like a real job that I was working on, like I was doing a promo for AMC, and I needed this to be black and white, and I really needed the black and white levels to be perfect. To just like the blacks to be really inky and the whites to be really white, and the medium tones to just feel really perfect in there, okay? So the way that I would do this is actually a 2-step process. First thing I'm going to do is select this, my layer, the photo, and go up to Effect and Color Correction. And I'm just going to apply a black and white effect on the top of this, right? So I'm going to click this, and that'll open my effect panel over here. And let me shrink this down a little bit. Or actually, let me just close this panel here because I do not need it, okay? And I'll widen this out a little bit. So black and white effect, really, it has uses, like you can make a lot of adjustments here in the black and white to the different channels. But I almost always just use it just to quickly make something black and white, okay? And then I feel like I will adjust the rest of this shot in levels, okay? So first I just put a generic black and white effect on it, all right? And then I click on the layer, make sure it's selected, and then go up to Effect and go back to Color Correction, and then all the way down here to Levels. Now I know we talked about color correction effects when we did Noel's neckties or Harry's hats or whatever, but and all we really talked about were color correct effects. That's because for the most part these are really like design friendly effects in After Effects where you can make small adjustments to things to just make your artwork look a lot better, which is kind of a big step in After Effects because you're almost always applying some sort of form of color correct in After Effects. It's just really good at that, right? So I'm going to go to Effect, Color Correct, and Levels, right? And that'll apply the Levels effect up here into my effect controls for this shot, okay? And I had my black and white open, and I just twirled the arrow down because I just don't need to see any of those values, right? So here we are in Levels. Now, the way to look at Levels, okay, this is a little bit tricky, this one, I think because maybe it was color or whatever, but usually the way this works is you have pretty clearly defined like 2 little shoulders, I think they're called. There's some technical terminology here. It's basically just like where this kind of slopes down here and where this slopes down here. And what you're supposed to do is kind of take the white level, which is represented by this little slider here, and move this up till it's somewhere around the end of that shoulder there, okay? And then do the same for the black one. Kind of put it sort of at the end of where this information is right here, okay? And right away you can see if I turn this off by clicking this FX button and turning it back on and off, right away this is way better than this. I mean, once you see that, this just looks really low con, and then when you see this, it's like just that little bit nicer and more high contrast. The final step here is to adjust the middle value, which might be the gamma, I think that's called. I don't know, and it really doesn't matter. But this is where you'll really dial it in and get this to look just the way you want it. Just say you want it to look like kind of edgy and moody and sort of like a little bit more night, you could like dial this down so it's a little bit darker behind him. Then you could always move the white value back up a little bit so that it's less like burning. Because if I turn the white up too much, you'll see like right here in his cheek, he kind of blows out and it's no good. So you can kind of see that right there start to happen. So you want to be careful with the white and in the relationship between the white and this middle value. But you can really get some nice color correct out of this. And again, if you compare this to how it originally looked, or even like that, I just think this is a way sexier contrast for this shot, okay? Right on. So that's Levels, and I would try to use that on a lot of things. It doesn't necessarily have to be just black and white, though it works really well with black and white, okay? Let's move on to effect number 2 that we're going to talk about. Gaussian blur, okay? Now, Gaussian blur is definitely more of a sexy effect that people always want to know. Now, there's a lot of blurs, and let's just look at this for one sec. So up here in effect, if you look at the blurs, whoops, there's a lot of blurs. There's a bilateral blur, there's a camera lens blur, there's cross blurs and radial blurs and vector blurs and channel blurs and directional blurs and blah, blah, blah. Okay, radial blurs. And those all have really specific uses, and sometimes those are great. Like a directional blur, for example, here, will allow you to blur things just, for example, horizontally if you want, so that it's moving. It can kind of like blur horizontally or whatever. And that's really cool and really useful sometimes. I used to use blurs a lot in my work when I was younger, and now I find that I almost never use blurs, but whatever. When I do use blurs, I tend to use this Gaussian blur, which they also have in Photoshop, if you're a Photoshop person. And Gaussian blur is, I think it's named after a mathematician named Gauss. I don't know. And it's just a really sweet blur here. I'm going to click this on, and you can see that now I put that on for my AE Kickstart layer. And if I ramp up the blurriness, or if I twirl this down here and use this little slider, you can see that this kind of gets just like blurrier and blurrier. And what I kind of like about this is it's a very organic blur. It kind of feels like it's turning into like a cloud or something, you know? So I kind of like that. Before we animate any of that, though, I do want to show another trick, because I have a kind of specific animation in mind for this shot that I want to show you, all right? Which is kind of this, like, I like blur and type sometimes together. I think it can really look nice together. So here's a little animation that I've done in the past. It's like a little bit of a sci-fi thing for like a little title or something, right? So I have this word AE Kickstart, which I just typed in here as normal. And we didn't really talk much about these text animators, but if you twirl down here and then twirl down, and then you'll see next to text there are these animate, and then there's like a little tab here, okay? And this is how we can animate the tracking of type that we create in After Effects. Tracking is kind of like kerning, sort of same thing if you're familiar with that term. So I'm going to turn on tracking, and that kind of gives me this little animator here, okay? And what that allows me to do at a glance, or in a nutshell I should say, is change the tracking amount so that I can kind of like space that out like that, right? That's working that way, by the way, because actually I need to turn this back on in my paragraph. I have this as, you know, centered text. If I had it like this, it would be widening out and tracking from the left side or the right side. So make sure, if you want to try this, that you put the paragraph in the center, okay? And so let's see. What I'm going to do is animate this. I'm going to put this back down to 0, and I'm going to make a keyframe for the tracking amount 0, and then I'm going to go like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, or something, like a long time, like 3.5 seconds or something. And I'm going to track this out now till like here, right? And, you know, so right now that just animates like that, which is cool enough on its own, and I think that might be a fun thing for you guys to try sometime. But check this out. If I also animate the blur at the same time, right, I'm going to make a blur keyframe here at frame 0 for 0 amount of blur. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the end here, and I'm going to blur the heck out of this. I'm going to turn it up to like, I don't know, 40, which is, you know, you can see that it's kind of like almost completely off, and, you know, blurred out, I should say. And let's preview that. Right? So, you know, this is more like an exit for the type. Like it's already been on screen and then it's like moving off like this. But you can kind of see, you know, this might even need to be longer because it's tracking out so far. But it's pretty fun. It has this like kind of cool like sci-fi vibe to it. And you could even like, I think that blur might be too much. Or you could start the blur like a little bit later so that it's like tracking first and then it starts to blur. Yeah, I think that looks nicer. And you could even, at the end here, you could have this like, you could also hit Shift-T to show the opacity, make a 100% opacity keyframe, and then do a nice long slow kind of like fade out there as well. Yeah, that's pretty sweet. So, yeah, blur, you know, can work sometimes really nicely with graphics and sometimes not. All right, I'm going to say, here's another example of using some blur. So I have this circle, right, and I just made this the normal way, right? It's not animated at all. And I want to make it like a little burst animation, okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the beginning, and I'm going to twirl down here, and I'm going to look at my contents at my ellipse path, right? And I'm going to make a keyframe here. It doesn't really matter what, and I'm going to go to like for, I don't know, 3 seconds, okay? And I'm just going to copy and paste that keyframe. And I'm also going to, let's say, go up here to Effect and go to Blur and Sharpen and Gaussian Blur. Okay, and I'm going to make a 0 Gaussian Blur keyframe there, and I go back to the beginning, and I will just, let's see, make another Gaussian Blur keyframe at 0 there. Okay, so right now it's not doing anything. It's just hanging out, and it's got a bunch of keyframes. Oh, and also I want to press UU, and I want to go to the stroke width, and I make a stroke width keyframe there, and I'm going to go down here to the end and just click that to make another stroke width keyframe. Okay, so none of these values that I have in here are at all accurate. I just wanted to sort of like put keyframes in first. Okay, so now I'm going to go back to the beginning, and I'm going to type 0 in here so that the circle is just nothing, so it's going to be getting bigger, right? And let's see, this is, I could even make it get bigger, right? And I'm going to set the stroke width at the beginning to something large, like 50, okay? And then I'm going to go down here to the end, and I'm going to set it to 0, right? So that as the circle gets bigger, the stroke width actually gets smaller, so it's kind of a counter animation, right? And then I'm also going to, so I've got a 0 blur at the beginning, and then I'm going to go to the end here, and I'm going to make also like a blur like 30 or something, right? And let's check that out. And let me set my work area in there. Boom. So you see what's happening is it's like, it almost looks a little bit like a smoke ring or something. It's sort of like coming closer and dissipating and blurring out a little bit. Now I will say for this, we haven't talked a lot at all actually about eases yet, but this is the kind of thing that's dying for an ease and probably to be a little bit quicker. Let's see. I'm going to cheat and talk to you a little bit about eases so I can show you how you can do this, make this a little bit cooler. With something like a burst, I'm going to click here, Keyframe Assistant, and go to Easy Ease, or F9, to put some handles, some Bezier curves on here. And I'm going to go into the graph editor, which we haven't talked about at all, so I'm probably really confusing everybody, but check this out. If I were to take the beginning of my animation and push this back that way, and take the end of the animation and do like that, now we could get a burst that's like really fast at the start and then slows down a lot and eases out at the end. Okay, really advanced there. Don't sweat it. We'll get to that eventually in this class, but I just want to show you and tease you a little bit with the graph editor. So there's another use for blur, and you know, I'm kind of integrating it into the animation. I'm not just making it blur all on its own in either example here, which is kind of cool. And I find with effect that the more you can kind of stack things, either effects or effects plus animation, so that it looks exactly the way you want, it just looks less like a canned effect that, you know, anybody could apply to their work. And, you know, just to pause here for a sec, this is kind of the reason why, like, I don't use a lot of effects or really obvious effects in my work personally. This is a personal choice. I just feel like, you know, when you apply like the mosaic effect to something, it always looks like the way everybody's work looks when they apply the mosaic effect. So I find that, you know, these effects, since everybody has them basically, that they can make your work a little bit more generic if you're not careful. And if you do want to use effects, I think that combining them in new and interesting ways with animation makes it a whole lot better too. It just makes it more unique and personal to yourself. Okay, so that's my little spiel there. Let's move on. Oh yeah, this one's really cool. Excuse me. So we're going to talk about one called CC Bendit. And this is in a category of distortion effects. And let's talk about this for a sec. So distortion effects, I find that students always get really excited about because they do sexy kind of physical things on screen. So if I go up to effect here, you can see that there's this whole category called distort. We're going to talk about CC Bendit, but I'm just going to take a second to just show a couple of these other ones like twirl, for example. That's a really good example of one that students, a lot of people use at the beginning, but rarely later, I feel like. Okay, so this just literally like twirls this, right? And you'd think that'd be really cool. It's really, really easy to overdo it. And with almost all these distortion effects, the more you ramp these values up, I think the less interesting they are. Like if you just need something to do like this pretty subtle little warp, like maybe that's super cool, right? You can also, for example, change the center of the twirl. Right now it's there, that's why it looks like that. You could put it, for example, here. And then it would twirl like this, you know? So yeah, there's a lot you can do with that. You see this makes a kind of stiff transition there though, right? So twirl, that's one of those ones that like seems like it's kind of sexy at the start. Let's see what else, like wave warp, you know, yeah, this kind of stuff, and you can like really crank it up and change it and do all sorts of stuff, right? So if you need to do something like that, then that's exactly what you want, right? Any case, so yeah, I guess try out a bunch of distortion effects on your own, and then get rid of them and move on from it. That's how I think. In any case, distortion effects are really specific and don't overdo them. However, CC Bend-It is really cool, and I love this one, so I wanted to show this to you, and it's a little bit confusing and useful. So here you go. So I'm going to select my strip here and Effect, Distort, CC Bend-It, right? And you can see right away that it kind of like messes up my art, and that might be like initially like, oh, I don't like this right away, but all you have to do is, CC Bend-It's all about saying like what's the start and what's the end and where you want something to bend from. So right now the default, the start is here and the end is here, which means it's just not like really grabbing all of my artwork. So if I take the start and move it over here, and then I move the end, you see like even in the middle here or at the end here or something, I'm going to put it in the middle of my artwork for right now because that's generally where I want it, and it's for this reason, okay? So now with that all set up here in my panel, I can do this, right? And that's a sweet little bend right there. Much better than like twirl or whatever. And you know, you can, you know, depending on where the start and end is, this might move it around a little bit. But you can also try these other kinds of bends as well. Like here it'll bend just from the one end, and that's also a much smoother edge than that twirl thing that we just looked at. So yeah, so I find that CC Bend-It's actually really, really useful. Like even just like a little character thing, if you have to make him like frown or smile, or if you're like animating this a little bit like the way we did the mustache or the way I did the mustache in Harry's Hats, was sort of like to have like a little kind of flapping bend on something. It's really easy and useful to do this with CC Bend-It. So I would definitely recommend checking that out and playing around with it. Okay, so that's CC Bend-It. I really like that one. And then number 4 is Fractal Noise, which this one's really cool, and it's a little bit complex. And I'm going to show it a very specific instance of it, because Fractal Noise is one of those things that you could do a billion things with it, but I'm going to show you this one, which I really like. And again, I'm returning to this black and white photo of Don Draper, which I made black and white. And just to show, because you need kind of a background here. So what I'm going to do is show you how to use Fractal Noise to create some kind of like, just like moving grit on screen. All right, I have a tutorial on YouTube about this, but I'm going to go really quickly through this. But if you press Command Y to make a new solid, and let's go ahead and make that a black solid. Okay, pretty familiar thing here. Hit OK. So now we have a black solid, and I'm going to go up here to Effect and Noise and Grain, Fractal Noise. Okay, and then in the noise and grain category, there's a bunch of interesting other like choices and stuff. But I'm not going to talk about those now, but Fractal Noise is really cool. So when you put Fractal Noise on, right away it creates this like, I don't know, like it's like a close-up of a sponge or something you're looking at. And you know, in terms of effects, this right here, this is like a more complex one than a lot of the ones that we've used before. It's got a lot of buttons in there. However, we're really only going to use a couple of these, so don't sweat it if this just immediately made you like want to go cry somewhere, okay? We're going to use basically like 4 settings of this, and that's it, okay? The first one we're going to use is this contrast, okay? Contrast and brightness. And what I want in this case is a black field with little white specks, okay? So I'm going to ramp up the contrast a lot so that it's really black and white with like not that much gray area there, okay? And then I'm going to take the brightness and I'm going to ramp this down. And what I'm trying to go for is something where I've got like this, like white flecks on screen, and it's mostly black, right? Okay, so far so good. I've got that at 521 and the brightness at -223, okay? Now I'm going to go into this transform and into the scale here, okay? And I'm going to make these dots a lot smaller. And you can see if you make them really small, it sort of looks like a star field, which is another interesting way to make a star field, by the way. I'm going to make them about that size, and now I'm just going to look at my contrast again and maybe roll this down a little bit more, right? Something like that. For this lecture, doesn't matter, and you'll set this to your eye, okay? So that's it with the transform and the contrast and the brightness. Now so, you know, actually before I animate this, right now we have white flecks on a black field, right? Which we can't see the photo at all underneath, but what I want is to see the photo. So what I have to do is use one of these transfer modes here, okay? These are the same as in Photoshop. Blending modes, actually, is what they're called now. They used to be called transfer modes. Now they're called blending modes. Blending mode is, I think, a better name. And if you don't see this panel, by the way, make sure to click on this button right here, and that will show you the panels, right? Now, there's a lot of choices in here. Mostly they fall into these kind of 4 categories. These here, these are kind of what I call like, they're basically like multiply effects. And if I put that on, it's added, it preserves the black and makes the white transparent. So it's really not doing anything right now. But if we put on kind of the opposite, which is like an add effect, it drops out the black and just keeps the white on screen. So that's like what we want in this case right now. Okay, now we can see Don Draper poking through there, and you know, that's fine. But right now, like, there's no animation going on, and what I want is this to have like this, you know, some movement in this little grid, right? So in order to do that, we have to talk about the 4th little property of fractal noise that we're gonna play with. But really, this is it. And to go down here into these evolution options, okay? And then there's this thing here called the random seed, which, I don't know, sounds sort of like the name of a children's book or something to me. There once was a random seed. Anyway, but here, as I twirl this value, you'll see exactly on screen what I'm talking about, all right? So check this out. So now this is like making what looks like a little sprinkle of noise and dirt, right? And I just have to change this value, and that's what it does. So I'm going to set this back to 0, and I'm going to go back to the beginning of my comp, and I'm going to make a keyframe for random seed. The random seed who lives in the forest. Oh, sorry, I can't stop doing that. And now I'll go to the end of my composition, and basically you just want to crank up this value, but this is a little tricky. You know, let's say I set it 100 first. Depending on how long your composition is how high you want to set this value, because as I play this down, you'll see, well, that's actually pretty nice. That's a pretty good level of rate for the grit, right? It's happening, but it's not like too fast or whatever. So that's not too bad. If I went here and I cranked this up to like 1,000 or something, it would be like super fast like this, or maybe that's what you're looking for. I don't know. But that rate, depending on how you change this, it's going to change the amount of like little gritty flecks that are on screen, right? So that's fractal noise, and that's just one of the many, many uses for fractal noise. I'm telling you, fractal noise is one of those big ones that as you do more work in After Effects, you'll probably use a little bit more often. Cool. So the final one I want to talk about is drop shadow, which I'm kind of ending on like a because it's not as sexy as CC Bandit or fractal noise, but it's super useful, okay? So let's look at this, okay? So right now I have a white background, fully white. And what I want to talk about is how I can have white type on a white background and save the day and make it totally readable by using drop shadow, and not in a really harsh, obvious way. And the reason that I'm explaining this is because I've done a lot of commercial work where you are putting type on top of film or photography, and it almost always happens if you've got a moving shot and you need to put type in the middle, that something white is going to pass through the screen, like a reflection of something, or the camera moves up and there's like a cloud in the sky or something. And almost always what happens is you have white type and it's passing over something that's very light on screen. That's part of the footage. And your client doesn't want a drop shadow, but they need the type to be white and need to stand out. So it's kind of like becomes this impossible situation. But I've got a fix for you here, okay? So what I'm going to do is Shift-Option-Command-T and then type some sample type here. And what I did is my sample type is white. Okay, it says sample type, but I'm going to set it back down to white. Here, one sec. I'm actually going to spread this out a bit so it's a little easier to see. Okay, so I'm going to make it white, right? So it's white type on white background, so we can't see it. So we're in trouble, right? No. Click it and go up here to Effect and, okay, Perspective, and then Drop Shadow. Now, right away, this is going to add this like harsh, I mean, this is kind of interesting because it looks kind of like an embossed thing, white with the black drop shadow. So you could probably like make something cool with that and kind of like, I don't know, drop this down to more of a gray or whatever. Anyway, that could be interesting, but that's not what I want to talk about today. What I want to talk about today is if I take the distance up here and drop this down to 0, okay, and then, so right now you can kind of see it looks a bit messed up, and actually I'm going to, here's a shortcut for you that I haven't talked about yet, Command-J. I was working at half res, okay? We haven't talked about this at all yet, and I'm going to have to talk about this in something other than this lesson, but you have these different resolutions you could look at your work at. In this class, you can almost always look at something full. But the keyboard shortcuts are Command J sets that to full, Shift Command J sets that to half resolution, and Shift Option Command J sets that to quarter resolution. So if you're like working on a really complex shot that has tons of layers and you're just sort of looking for timings or something, you could set it to quarter resolution. In this case, I'm going to Command J and set it at full. Sorry for that distraction. But you can still see here this looks pretty lousy. You certainly want to hand this off to a client. And also it's not readable yet. But, okay, if I change the softness now, right away you can see that it's readable, but you're really still aware of the shadow in there. And then there's kind of a sweet spot in here as you crank this up that, like, you're really not aware of the shadow so much, but you can see the type and it's all totally readable. And I think that's really cool. It's almost kind of like a cool effect. It looks like a stencil or something, and you can also change this opacity down and really like tease this out so that it's just like it's there but it's barely there, right? So that's a graphic thing, but if you were over footage you'd have like a little bit more leeway here to ramp this up or whatever. But this is a really nice way to add like a little bit of a smudgy shadow behind type without like making a really obvious drop shadow. But as you can see here, if you can read white type on a fully white page, this type is pretty readable on any background. So that's really useful. Okay, so that's 5 useful effects that I use all the time in my work. Obviously there's tons more effects, and there's some really, high-level, crazy effects that are very expensive that you could purchase for After Effects too, which do amazing, nutty things. We'll talk about those in another lecture. But just for now, know that all 5 of these ship with After Effects, and they come standard with it, like I said, and you can start using them right now in your work. So have fun with those and enjoy. Thank you very much.
If you had a microscope and could look at a piece of a leaf, you would see thousands of tiny openings which branch out until the leaf has all of the materials it needs. What happens now?